Hello again, this is Dr. Sangram Patil, and this is third lecture of the life processes chapter in your CBSE Year 10 book, and we'll be looking at the respiration today. So respiration section will consist of few activities that are given in your CBSE Year 10 book, and then some pathways that are involved in respiration. And we'll look a little bit into the energy currency of the living beings, that is ATP molecule, and also talk about the respiration in various organisms, that is aquatic, amphibians, and the terrestrial organisms. And then in the end, we'll have a brief look at human respiration. So you don't need great details of human respiration for year 10. You'll be learning more in your year 11, 12, and those who go for medical studies, they will be learning it in great details. So let's begin with the activity that is given in your CBSE book. So this activity, that is 6.4, that wants you to take some freshly prepared lime water in a test tube. So that's the lime water in a test tube. Okay, so there are two test tubes, and one test tube you are blowing air through this lime water. You are just blowing the expired air from your mouth. Okay, so that puts your expired gases into the lime water. And then the second tube, they want you to use this kind of pump or a syringe to pass the air to pressurize the air that passes through the lime water in the test tube here. And then they want you to make observations. So the results will be the expired air from our mouth that is blown into this test tube in lime water will have carbon dioxide, and that carbon dioxide, the lime water, it will react with the lime and it will cause precipitation of a milky white substance, and the lime water here will turn milky white very soon, within few blows. And whereas here, because you are pushing fresh air that has got a very little carbon dioxide, will take a lot of time for this lime water to turn milky, or it may not turn milky if you don't try hard enough. So remember, there's a carbon dioxide in a expired air that causes precipitation of the lime to cause a milky white color to the lime water in a test tube where we are blowing the expired air. Now there is another experiment activity they want you to try, and it is in relation to the carbon dioxide again. And that activity is they want you to put some fruit juice or a sugar solution and add some yeast to this, and this mixture is taken into the test tube. A cork fitted at the top will close the test tube, but it will have a bent tube that carries the gases here through the tube into another test tube where there will be a calcium hydroxide solution. So that experiment, and they want you to, so this is basically a lime solution, lime water. So they want you to notice the change in the lime water color. Again, because the yeast is unicellular bacteria, it metabolizes, and the metabolism in the yeast is the process called fermentation, that is anaerobic respiration. It causes breakdown of the sugar or the juice that is there in the test tube that releases carbon dioxide. Okay, and this carbon dioxide combines with the lime here, and that causes milky precipitate. So this property of release of carbon dioxide from the yeast after coming in contact with sugary substance is used in bakery. So yeast that is used in bakery products releases CO2, and CO2 then raises the dough that is used in bakery, and it makes it spongy. So the cake or the bread becomes spongy because of the cavities that are generated by the CO2 that is released by the yeast. Okay, so let's move on to the actual text in this chapter. So this talks about the respiration. Okay, now we have seen the nutrition in the previous video. If you haven't watched that, you can go to the channel and watch the nutrition video. The food material that is taken inside the body through the process of nutrition is converted into the energy. Okay, and that energy is in the form of ATP. So different organisms do this conversion into energy in different ways. Some use oxygen to break down the glucose that is available into carbon dioxide and water, but some use no oxygen. So first step, that is, so those who use oxygen, they are meant to have an aerobic respiration, and without oxygen, that is anaerobic respiration. And the example of anaerobic respiration is a fermentation in the yeast that causes production of energy and carbon dioxide without using any oxygen, in the absence of oxygen. So the first step of breakdown of glucose in any case, whether it is aerobic or anaerobic, is breakdown of glucose into pyruvate, and that takes place in the cytoplasm of the cell. Now this step, glucose, involves glucose, that is 6 carbon molecule, to get converted into 3 carbon pyruvate molecule, and there is a release of energy. Okay, now that is the first step, and it's same for every organism. Now after this step, in various organisms you can see different processes. Now let's have a look into this. This is an important diagram. The second step. So in presence of oxygen, have a look at this bottom pathway that takes place in mitochondria. Remember, the first step takes place in cytoplasm. The second step, in presence of oxygen, will be in mitochondria. The pyruvate will be converted further into carbon dioxide, that is three molecules of carbon dioxide, water, and energy. But in the human being itself, if there is a lack of oxygen, such as happens in our muscles when we are running or doing very vigorous exercise, high intensity exercise, there's not enough oxygen available in that circumstances. So pyruvate will not get converted into carbon dioxide, water, energy, but it will give rise to lactic acid, that is another 3 carbon molecule, and it will release the energy. So this will take place in muscles when we are doing intense exercise in the absence of oxygen. But in certain organisms like yeast, the process is anaerobic, and that will lead to production of ethanol. Okay, so fermentation gives rise to ethanol that we have seen in our previous classes, and then there is a release of carbon dioxide and energy. So ethanol is a 2 carbon molecule. Okay, that takes place in yeast, and that's called fermentation. And this energy that is released here is used to make ATP molecules. So these ATP molecules are also called as energy currency of the body. Okay, so ATP is adenosine triphosphate. Okay, remember this. And it is organic molecule that is generated inside the living being. It acts as the main energy carrier inside the cell. So this gives the chemical structure of the ATP. So it is a adenine, ribose, and phosphates. Okay, you don't need to remember this chemical formula, but remember there is adenosine, that is adenine, and then ribose, and there is a phosphate element. Okay, so let's go into a little bit more details of this ATP. So as I mentioned, the energy release during the respiration is used to combine ADP, adenosine diphosphate, and a phosphate bond. To combine this, the energy is absorbed to make this bond, and it gives rise to ATP, that is adenosine triphosphate. So adenosine diphosphate is converted into triphosphate, and this is now a currency. It's like a money kept in your bank account. So it can be used immediately or later on when your body needs it. Now when the body needs it, the terminal phosphate linkage that was combined here during the synthesis of ATP, that is broken. That phosphate linkage is broken, so energy is released, and that energy can be used for various processes like movements, metabolism, growth, or any other activity that needs energy. And then ATP gets converted into ADP, and there is a release of phosphate. Okay, so this ATP breakdown releases energy, and that energy is used to drive the endothermic reactions that take place in the body of the organism. Now, endothermic reaction, what does it mean? That it simply means that there is absorption of the heat during these reactions. And what is exothermic reactions? These reactions, they release heat. So there is increase in the temperature in the surrounding tissues when it is exothermic reaction. Endothermic reaction absorbs heat, so there is a reduction in temperature in the surrounding because they take up heat. Yeah, so this is again a revision. Terminal phosphate linkage in ATP is broken down using water, and the energy released is equivalent to 30.5 kilojoule per mole. So just remember this for your entrance exams. Don't need to remember for CBSE exam syllabus as such. Energy in this aerobic process is this process involves aerobic mechanism, at least in the beginning, and then if it does take place in mitochondria, then energy released is much greater than anaerobic processes in comparison to the fermentation or the anaerobic processes that take place in muscle. So aerobic is more energy efficient process than anaerobic. Okay, so now let us look at few more details about these energy mechanisms and respiration that are involved in various organisms. So since aerobic respiration depends on oxygen, the aerobic organisms need to make sure that they have sufficient intake of oxygen. Otherwise, they will develop hypoxia and they may not be able to survive very well. Now, plants exchange gases through stomata. Okay, so that is in the plants. And large intercellular spaces, they make sure that all the cells are in contact with air. And carbon dioxide and oxygen are exchanged by diffusion. Okay, and they can go into the cell or away from them and out into the air. The direction of this diffusion depends upon the environmental condition and what the plant requires at that time. such as during night when there is no sun, there is no photosynthesis taking place here. So CO2 elimination is the major exchange activity. So there is a CO2 elimination during dark hours, and oxygen is taken in for the use of the plant. During the day, the CO2 generated during respiration is used by the cells for photosynthesis, and there is no CO2 release, whereas the oxygen that is generated during the reaction is released outside. That's why it feels very fresh to stay under the tree during light hours than it does during the night hours. Animals have different organs for uptake and uptake of oxygen and release of carbon dioxide in the surrounding tissue. The terrestrial animals can breathe oxygen in the atmosphere, but the animals that are in the water, they need to use oxygen that is dissolved in the oxygen. Okay, so we'll see few more details here. So those animals, organisms that are unicellular like amoeba or paramecium, entamoeba, they will have a direct diffusion of gases across their cell membrane, and then that flow of the direction of the gases will depend on the concentration gradient between two sides. So the oxygen inside will be less in comparison to the environment, so oxygen will be taken in and the CO2 will diffuse out by simple diffusion. Whereas in more advanced animals, the oxygen will be brought to the blood vessels through a system of canals and tubes, and in the end there will be a balloon-like alveolus that will increase the surface area of contact between the air and the blood. So this is the alveolus and that is the blood vessel, and there will be oxygen and carbon dioxide diffusion along the concentration gradient. Okay, so this is the exchange surface. It's a very delicate exchange surface, the alveolo-capillary membranes here. That's why they have to be protected, and that is why they are protected inside the body, whereas in unicellular organisms the exchange surface is actually out on the surface of the body. Here the exchange surface in more advanced organisms are protected inside the body cavity. Now there is a difference between the respiration that takes place in aquatic, that is those animals that live in the water, and terrestrial that live on the land. So this is in organisms living in water, and that's land organisms. Aquatic respiration involves oxygen that is dissolved in water. Terrestrial respiration involves oxygen that is in the air, atmospheric air. The main respiratory organ in aquatic respiration is gills. Main respiratory organ in terrestrial respiration is generally lungs. Okay, gills are tough and spiny. Lungs are moist, slippery and soft. Breathing rate is high. Breathing rate in terrestrial respiration is generally low because they have more oxygen available. Okay, so the same thing is described here in more details. So that's the fish respiration process. The fish draws water through the mouth, and then it passes through a set of gills, these structures here. It passes over the gills, and then water is passed out. While it passes over these gills, there is a diffusion of oxygen and carbon dioxide that takes place. So they act like lungs. Some animals do have exchange of gases through their body surface, through the lung-like primitive system. So they breathe through the nostril, and there is a combination of mechanisms that causes diffusion of gases. So there is a diffusion across the skin, diffusion into the mouth cavity, and also there is a lung mechanism. Whereas in more advanced animals, there is a dedicated system of passages and tubes that connects the atmosphere with the lung, and in the lung there are various alveoli that are in contact with the blood vessels, and they act as exchange surfaces, and we'll look into more details in the end of this video. Now there's an activity your book wants you to do. They want you to observe a fish in an aquarium. They open and close their mouth and the gill splits. So they want you to observe the frequency of this gill split and the frequency of the mouth opening and closing, and whether it is coordinated activity. Count the number of times the fish opens and closes mouth and compare this with number of times the human being breathes in and out in a minute. So it's a simple activity. Again, the fish has a aquatic respiration, and there's a very little oxygen in the water. That is described as 9 milligram per liter. Yeah, so it's less amount, whereas in air, so 21% of air is oxygen, so large amount for the terrestrial organisms to breathe. So fish opens and closes their mouth and gills around 90 to 100 times a minute, and human being breathe about 12 to 20 a minute in adults especially. This can be more in neonates and infants, little children. So that's the explanation of the activity. Now then we move on to the main topic, and that is the last topic of this chapter. That is human respiratory system, human respiration. Okay, so human beings take air into the body through the nostrils. So these are the nostrils, the openings at the tip of the nose. There are two nostrils. The air passing through the nostrils here is filtered, and it is filtered by fine hairs that line this passage. Okay, so that is filtration of the dust and other major particles, insects. They are filtered out, so they don't pass in. What happens if they pass in? If they come here in the nose, you will have a sneeze. If they come up to the throat, you will have a cough in an attempt to throw that foreign particle, dust particle, or insects or anything that tries to pass into the airways through nostrils. So these passages are also lined by mucus. So remember, there are hair and there is a mucus. Okay, now what does this mucus do? So mucus can be written as M-U-C-O-U-S or M-U-C-U-S. Okay, it's got two spellings, American and British English. So this mucus also helps in filtration, because the dust particles and small foreign particles will just get stuck to the mucus and they won't be able to pass through the throat into the lungs. So from nasal cavity, the air enters into the pharynx. Okay, so you can see this is a pharynx. From pharynx, it enters into the larynx. So that's the larynx, where our vocal cords are located. Our sound apparatus, from where the sound comes, is the larynx. The larynx leads to the trachea. So trachea lies, so pharynx, larynx and trachea, they lie in our throat. So you can see it's lying in the throat. The trachea also extends into the chest. What is trachea? It is the tube, it's the passage that carries air between pharynx, larynx on one side and lungs on the other side. Okay, so that's the trachea. And what does trachea contain? From inside, it is lined by a delicate membrane, mucous membrane, and then it is surrounded by rings of cartilage. So these rings of cartilage, these are C-shaped cartilage. So that is the front of the trachea and that is the back of the trachea. So that C is placed in the front of the neck. Okay, so if this is the trachea, then the C-shaped cartilages are located in the front. Okay, so that is the trachea. Now the air passage, because of these cartilages, their trachea doesn't collapse. In some people, these cartilages may not be very well developed and the airways then collapse and they have a difficulty in breathing. So they can die if they don't get help in time. Okay, but you don't need to know all those medical conditions at this stage. In the lungs, the passages, they divide and subdivide. So trachea divides into two bronchi. Okay, so look at this bronchi. So one right bronchus, left bronchus, and two bronchi. Bronchi divide into bronchioles, that are smaller passages. Bronchiole then leads to respiratory bronchiole. Okay, so I'll show you that in this diagram. So trachea divides into two bronchi, the right and the left. The bronchi divide into further smaller bronchi and bronchioles. So these are conducting airways. They conduct the air. Okay. The bronchioles further divide and subdivide into respiratory bronchioles. So difference between conducting airways and respiratory areas is that from the respiratory bronchiole onwards, there is a gas exchange taking place. Whereas in conducting airways, there is no gas exchange. Okay. So respiratory bronchiole, they divide, subdivide, and they give rise to alveolar duct. These are small duct. Remember, these are gas exchange areas. Alveolar duct will have a dilated ends. They are called as alveoli. So alveoli is plural and alveolus is single. Okay. So alveolus, that is single. So that is the passage, airways. Okay. Now little bit more details about the same topic that has been given in your book. The alveoli provide surface where the exchange of gases can take place. These are terminal balloon-like expansions of the air passages. The walls of the alveoli contain an extensive network of blood vessels. So I'll show you that here in this diagram. Okay. So there is a alveolus and this is a network of blood vessels around it and they act as an exchange surface. Okay. Now when we breathe in, so look into this diagram. When we breathe in, the chest expands. So chest expands in all directions, front, back, and little bit on the sides. And the diaphragm contracts and it is pushed down. It becomes more flat. Okay. So it pushed down because it contracts down. Okay. So flat diaphragm contracts down. It expands the chest cavity and the air is sucked in through the nasal cavity. And when we expire, then the diaphragm relaxes the chest cavity collapses. So it becomes narrow, it becomes smaller in size, and this recoil, this collapse of the lungs, causes air to be pushed out through the airways and goes out. So inspiration takes place with the contraction of diaphragm and as well as other muscles of the chest wall and neck, whereas exhalation or expiration takes place when the contraction stops. So it happens automatically. When the contraction stops, the chest wall and the lungs, they just coil back, they just collapse back, and the air is pushed out. So it is a passive. Exhalation is a passive process. Inhalation is an active muscle contraction. Okay, muscle contraction of the diaphragm. So remember this. So because of this continuous contraction and relaxation of diaphragm and other muscles of respiration, there is a continuous inspiration and expiration going on, and the air is brought from the environment to the alveoli, and then oxygen from the alveolus enters into the blood, and carbon dioxide that is brought from the tissues by the blood flow then is exhaled out into the alveolus, and that is transported out to the atmosphere. Now this is a continuous process, and respiration is so important that if we cannot get proper oxygen even for a few minutes, then we can die. If we cannot exhale carbon dioxide for some time, we can die. So these are important. Now this diffusion works here. Diffusion from higher oxygen concentration to the lower oxygen concentration. Similarly, carbon dioxide diffuses out from high to low carbon dioxide concentration. And then blood carries this oxygen away from the lungs to the body parts. Similarly, blood brings carbon dioxide from the body parts to the lung, so it can be expelled out. So this process involves the pigments, blood pigments, and these pigments, they take up oxygen and then they carry a lot of oxygen with them. Because simple diffusion is all right here at the alveolus level, but from here onwards, simple diffusion will be very inefficient to carry the oxygen into the blood. That is why the pigments, blood pigments, that is hemoglobin in human being, hemoglobin takes oxygen with it, and this oxygenated hemoglobin takes the blood away from lungs to different body parts. So it goes in the heart, and then heart pumps the blood outside. Similarly, carbon dioxide combines with hemoglobin in the periphery, and then it is brought here. But more carbon dioxide remains dissolved in the blood because it is more soluble in the blood than oxygen. That's why it is mostly transported into the blood as a dissolved carbon dioxide. So that is about diffusion and the pigment, blood pigment, that is hemoglobin. Hemoglobin, most of it is inside the cells called as red blood corpuscles or red blood cells, RBCs. Okay. Now in the periphery, the process is reversed. At the lungs, the oxygen is taken in and CO2 is expelled out. In the peripheral tissue, when the hemoglobin or red blood cell goes to the tissue, it releases the oxygen and takes up the carbon dioxide, and then it is carried to the lungs. So it's the opposite, reverse process in the periphery. Now human body surface area is about 1.72 meters square. That's the average in adults. It may be less or more in different people, but that's the average body surface area. Now alveolar surface area, if we spread all the alveoli on a flat surface, it is roughly equal to 80 meter squares. See, the whole body is 1.72, but the alveolar surface area is 80. It is so high in comparison to body surface area. That is why all the alveoli are squeezed together into a small organ called lung. Now, hemoglobin level in male is 14 to 18 gram per DL. So it's gram percent. Yeah. In females, it is 12 to 16. Remember, different books will give you different values. Okay. But this is quite standard value accepted in various books. So 14 to 18 for male, 12 to 16 for females. Of course, the Indian male and female, the values may be slightly less. And if the hemoglobin is reduced, the condition is called anemia. So we'll look into more details in next section that we are going to do in this chapter. That is going to be a transportation. So I'll see you in the next section. I hope you enjoyed this. Take care. Bye-bye.